The soldier was walking along the flooded road in the midst of the storm when he suddenly stopped. In a torn cardboard box, two little girls huddled together, their eyes pleading for survival. The soldier didn't know that his actions that day would change all three of their lives. What happened 19 years later? The storm John had passed 3 days ago, but the streets were still flooded, the sound of water pumps never stopping. The usual signs of relief efforts echoed in Elias's mind like thin wisps of smoke trailing behind a soldier leaving his post. He knew he was heading down a road with no map, no specific orders, and no one on the other end of the line to confirm what was right or wrong. Michael Reese tightened the strap of his backpack, heavy with water and dirt. Everything on him seemed to be pulling him down, much like the growing doubt that was settling in his chest. Something had melted into the mud and drifted away from his heart, but his legs kept moving down a narrow path littered with floating trash rags and twisted metal sheets scattered by the storm. No one had told him to go to the very end of the red dirt alley, but his instincts guided him. The instincts of someone who had lost his way in life and had once been pulled from a nameless dead end. There are paths that don't begin with green lights or signs, but start from a very small sound within the kind of sound no one else can hear. A faint sound mixed with the howling wind. He stopped. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the sound of leaking pipes. Michael Reese tilted his head, the flickering flashlight beam sweeping over the thick weeds, just as the light hit something dark brown and deformed. He crouched down, his steps slowing, as if afraid to disturb something both fragile and unreal. The cardboard box in front of him had been torn apart by time and rain, the sides crushed together as if still trying to protect its final shape. Inside there were no belongings, no discarded trash, but two tiny bodies curled up together. The older girl was holding the younger one as if she were the last blanket in the world, her wide-open eyes floating aimlessly as if all fear had run out, and all that remained was the habit of self-protection. Michael Reese sat down, slowly bringing his head level with the edge of the box so his gaze wouldn't be higher, wouldn't overwhelm them. Respect didn't need words, it only needed to be practiced. He didn't speak right away. Those eyes needed silence more than any question. The little girl didn't pull away, didn't scream. She simply held her sister tightly, as if letting go would dissolve both of them into the rainy night. The world at that moment shrank down to 4 eyes, his and theirs meeting in a silent but very real language. "Are you too cold?" he asked softly, as if afraid the question would shatter the fragile atmosphere before him. The older girl shifted her back just slightly, tightened her grip on her sister, her lips trembling lightly and her fingers turning pale. The air between them felt frozen in an old photo frame where everything had stopped and no one wanted to breathe too loudly and break it. Michael Reese silently took off his poncho, water dripping from his wrist as he draped the garment over the two small bodies. Not saying anything more, he stood up and pulled out his radio. "Station 1, this is Elias. I found 2 little girls abandoned in a cardboard box near the end of the western alley. Need a transport vehicle. Urgent." There was a moment of silence. Then the deep voice of the station chief crackled through the static. "There's no room left, Elias. They're all full. Take them back. You know how to keep the kids safe. And remember, don't let anyone see you sneaking out of the northern sector." But the voice on the other end sounded like it had grown too familiar with situations that no one could ever be prepared for. Michael closed the radio. He wasn't frustrated or tired, just letting out a heavy sigh. He bent down slowly, gently lifting the cardboard box and holding it between his arms. The smaller child rested her head against her sister's chest. The older girl kept her eyes on him as if searching for something familiar. Michael didn't look away from her gaze. On the roof of the old truck, the cardboard box sat still. The 2 girls didn't ask who he was, nor did they ask where they were going. In the darkness, without words, Michael knew they had nothing left to believe in, but nowhere else to hide. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine softly humming in the stillness. The road ahead was still wet with floodwater, the headlights too dim to fully illuminate the edges of the road. The truck swayed as if it too was uncertain about where it was heading, but Michael didn't hesitate. Some journeys don't start with orders from a superior, but with a moment when a person's heart meets the helplessness of someone weaker. Each turn was a decision to follow the harder path in silence. The truck bounced over potholes and flooded sections of road. After a while, a soft cough came from the back seat. Michael didn't turn around, just lowered his hand to adjust the rearview mirror to see the two small figures huddled beneath the military jacket. They weren't shivering anymore, but neither were they sleeping. Abandoned children don't sleep easily. A short time later, when the truck finally stopped at a safe place, Michael stepped out and opened the back door. Neither child moved. He didn't urge them, didn't beg. He just stood there, leaving the door open, the light spilling from inside like an unspoken invitation. It took a long while before Emily, the older girl, stepped out, pulling her sister with her. Without a word, their slow steps were an answer in themselves. Michael quietly opened the wooden cupboard where he kept the few clean supplies left after their hasty travels. He took out a folded towel, its soap scent faded but still somewhat comforting. He spread 2 thin blankets on the corner of the room, choosing a spot away from the window where the wind wouldn't reach them, then covered them with his old worn coat. He boiled water on a small stove, waiting for the steam to rise before pouring it into a chipped ceramic cup. As he moved toward Emily, she didn't reach for the cup like most would when they're cold. Instead, she looked straight at him, not questioning, not fearful, but as if considering something far bigger than her thirst. "You're not going to leave us, right?" she asked quietly. Michael sat beside her, not too close, not too far. "No. But if someday you feel something is wrong, or if someone makes you want to disappear like today, don't be silent. Just look at me like you are now and I'll understand." She didn't nod, nor did she agree out loud, but Zoe, her younger sister, clung tightly to her, and for the first time since they met, Michael heard a tiny sigh as light as raindrops hitting the ground. There was no clear reason why he kept the 2 girls with him, just an old saying from a mentor he once admired. Sometimes kindness doesn't need to be proved with reasons. It just needs a chance to stay. The wind blew again, but this time it didn't carry away the voices. Michael Reese was not used to silence this heavy. In the military, he had walked through many abandoned rooms where the sound of a wounded soldier's breath was more piercing than the crack of gunfire. But this silence was different. It didn't come from pain, but from a retreat, as if 2 small souls were huddling together to survive. He placed the small clay pot on the stove. The smell of boiled black beans mixed with rice water quietly filled the room. No one spoke. The 2 children remained seated on the thin blanket, their eyes briefly meeting, but never focusing on him. No one cried. There were no sniffles, no complaints. That was what made Michael Reese feel a chill in his bones. This first meal was unlike any aid mission he had ever participated in. There were no requests for more food, no mechanical thank yous. Just 2 tiny figures, one silent like a stone, the other huddled like a wet bird. A small spoon touched the rim of the porcelain bowl, making a soft sound, not sharp. Michael Reese slowly turned around. The older girl, the taller of the 2, still with tangled hair, had just placed the spoon into his bowl. She said nothing, avoided his gaze, and simply stepped back to the corner as if her actions had been an unnecessary risk. Michael Reese sat down. That small spoon, usually unnoticeable, made his fingers tighten around it. A spoon, and the emptiness inside his chest suddenly echoed. One doesn't need to speak to express hunger, just like one doesn't need words to feel the need to stay, he reminded himself quietly. The old phone vibrated. Michael Reese picked it up without looking at the screen. Pastor David's voice came through, still deep and warm as always. "What's going on, Elias? Why are you calling at this hour?" "I just need one thing, Father. The 2 children are lying here, not moving, but in their eyes, there's not a single trace of innocence. It's like they've gone through something even adults wouldn't dare to remember." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Pastor David spoke without hesitation. "Not everyone will understand why you're doing this. But if someone has the heart to not get in your way, then there's still hope tonight." Michael Reese nodded, even though he knew no one could see him. He hung up, then stood up to cover the 2 sleeping children, their heads resting against each other. The wooden door creaked softly. A quick, decisive knock followed. He turned the doorknob, opening the door just enough for the light from the outside lamp to spill into the room. The woman stood there, no umbrella, her long coat soaked through her neat hair, now tousled by the wind. Her dark eyes met his steady and unmoving like a summons that didn't need an invitation. "Are you Michael Reese?" "Yes." "I'm Rachel Monroe. I don't think anyone could abandon children in the middle of a storm, but if they did, then we need to hold on to these kids tightly." Her words rang out like an order, but it eased something in Michael's chest as though someone had just confirmed something he hadn't dared to say out loud. Rachel stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the room without asking questions. Michael didn't try to say anything more. He simply tilted his head toward the corner of the room where the two children huddled together, their foreheads nearly touching, as if the last bit of warmth in the world was enough for a single touch. Rachel pulled up a chair and sat down without opening a notebook. She spoke quietly. "I just want to know if this place can keep the children from shivering every time night falls. Not to fill out forms, but to know that at least tonight they'll have a proper shelter." Michael didn't reply. He simply bent down gently, picking up a dry piece of firewood beside the stove and placing it in the fire. The flames crackled and popped like a quiet affirmation. The light flickered on the wall enough to keep the two children from shivering in their sleep. The kitchen still carried the faint smell of dampness, the familiar scent of a home long void of children's laughter. Rachel's eyes scanned the room, each item old yet carefully preserved with thrift and respect. A pair of worn military boots hanging neatly on a reused plastic string, a dull knife placed carefully next to a tray of bread that had dried out from the previous meal. When her gaze landed on a small patched pillow with mismatched blue thread, she frowned slightly and then nodded as if understanding something that couldn't be written in a report. Rachel asked, "Did you sew the pillow yourself?" "I don't have many new things, so whatever I can fix, I fix." Rachel tilted her head, her eyes softening a little. "I've met many people who want to adopt children, but not everyone knows how to pick up a needle and sew something that seemed beyond repair." Michael didn't respond. He simply stood up, poured another cup of warm water, and placed it in front of her. No one said anything more. The fire crackled, and occasionally the wind tapped against the window. The children slept on even as the flames kissed their cheeks. As the clock hands past 12 once again, Rachel slowly stood up. Not in a hurry, she pulled out a small piece of paper from her jacket pocket, wrote a few short lines in a slanted hand, then neatly folded it and placed it in Michael's palm. "I'll be back, but for now you can keep them in emergency care. I don't promise anything beyond that, but I won't leave you alone." Michael took the paper, not opening it. He tucked it into his pocket and then looked at her as she moved toward the door. Before leaving, Rachel paused. People always look at skin color and last names before they look at what that person is doing, but children don't. They just need someone to stay when everyone else has left. Michael nodded. He didn't need more words to believe that some truths will never be written down in anyone's records. They are things you can only feel through moments of being turned away in the silent spaces between uneven breaths and in the small handprints left on old tablecloths. The two children left no names, but they left a space of life that Michael was no longer willing to walk away from. "When you asked me, I didn't answer right away. Not because I was hiding something, but because sometimes the things that go unspoken are the most painful." Zoe Reese didn't turn around. She was sitting beside an old wooden chair, her legs crossed, eyes focused on a small crack running down the leg of the table. Emily had fallen asleep, her hand still loosely holding onto a piece of cloth that Michael Reese had used as a makeshift blanket. Monica had already left the room, but her words still echoed in Elias's mind like an annoying bell. Briarwood isn't used to the unfamiliar. He hadn't answered, not because he was concerned with distant matters, but because the eyes of the two children didn't demand reassurance at that moment. They only needed his presence. Sometimes words are unnecessary. Silence alone is enough. Michael Reese stood up and walked to the small kitchen where the dim yellow light cast shadows over chipped ceramic plates. He poured some water and sat down. It had been almost 2 days, and neither child had spoken, but their actions set enough cautious glances flinching when someone approached the unbreakable bond between the two sisters. Every meal, Emily saved a small portion, secretly tucking it into Zoe Reese's old jacket pocket, as though afraid there wouldn't be any left next time. When Zoe Reese softly said, "I'm Zoe Reese. She's Emily Michael Reese, just looked at her, giving a slight nod as if the names didn't need further confirmation. It wasn't the first time the children had been given names, but it was the first time someone didn't ask, "Are you sure?" That evening was thick with a strange silence. The wind outside continued to blow in gusts, carrying the distant sounds of receding waters, sunken earth, and broken trees. Michael Reese leaned against the wall, his eyes still on the half-closed door. Monica returned, holding her phone. She didn't speak right away. She just sat down, placed a stack of papers on the table, and waited in silence, as if expecting Michael Reese to speak first. "You know already," Monica nodded, her hand still holding the now cold cup of tea. "It matches. Natalia Rivers, Stephen Grant, and the 2 children reported missing 2 days ago. Everything checks out. And no, it wasn't an accident. They crossed Silverton intending to escape the drug lord Carlos the Wolf Reyes and abandoned their 2 children." Michael Reese didn't say a word. He leaned forward, his gaze slowly resting on a faded photo in the report. In the crumpled image, a woman appeared with empty eyes, her face weary as if she had lost all concept of responsibility. Next to her was a bald man, his expression as blank as crumbling plaster, showing no trace of remorse or conflict. Michael Reese stared for a long time, as if trying to find something left in their faces, something that had once been the biological anchors for the 2 children, now lying still just a few steps away. But there was nothing. "What do you think?" Monica exhaled. "I think we need to make a decision soon. The legal system will intervene soon enough to either transfer them or place them for adoption." A soft sound broke the silence. It was Zoe Reese's voice, small but clear in each word. "Are we going to be taken away?" Michael Reese turned around. She was still looking at the ground, her small hand gripping the edge of her jacket. Monica looked at him. Michael Reese looked back. Neither of them said anything. The silence between adults isn't always because they don't know what to say, but because any word spoken could break something that is already fragile beyond measure. Zoe Reese shrank back as if the silence itself was the answer. Michael Reese gently leaned forward, his rough hand lightly resting on the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against a crease in the old cloth napkin. He didn't stroke it, didn't tighten his grip, he simply held it still as a quiet anchor, as if to say, "At least here there is someone who won't leave." "The kids don't know exactly what happened," Michael said softly, not looking at anyone, "but they know what it feels like to be left behind." Monica tilted her head slightly, her eyes looking down at the stack of papers as if searching for something that wasn't written there. A brief silence passed between breaths. Then she spoke slowly and evenly, as if reminding herself, "I don't hold a pen to judge Michael. But I have a responsibility to write down what is true. Just don't treat them like lost items that need to be returned." Something in his voice made Monica pause. In the small wooden house, the wind echoed as if wanting to interrupt everything. As night slowly drifted away from the porch, Michael Reese still sat beside the rickety wooden bed, holding silence as if counting every breath of his own. No wind was loud enough to drown out the quiet sighs that hung in the air. Then he spoke. "When I was 8 years old, they left me at a bus station. In the middle of a hot afternoon, I sat there waiting until it was dark. Everyone said, 'Your parents will come back.' But they didn't." Zoe Reese still didn't look up, but her breathing was calmer now. "I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I was afraid that if I cried, I wouldn't have any water left to drink if I had to wait another night." Emily stirred. Michael continued. "Then I got on the first car that stopped. The driver didn't ask anything. He didn't talk. But he gave me a piece of bread and an old jacket. I thought, if anyone asks me what I need, I'd only want that, not many words, just someone who won't walk away." He paused for a moment, outside the sound of a dog howling mixed with the wind. "I don't know what the future will bring. But if you ask me whether I would ever leave you..." Zoe Reese looked up. Her eyes were red but clear. "Then I think we've already gotten on this ride together. And this ride, it doesn't stop." Emily didn't open her eyes at that moment, but the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. In the dim night, Michael saw it. He gently pulled the worn blanket over the two girls. Sometimes a person doesn't need much except for an honest hand and a promise kept. In Briarwood, where everything moves slowly and quietly, the hardest thing isn't asking for permission, but earning trust. But once children trust, no oath is needed. Michael Reese stood up, returning to his chair. Outside, the wind still hadn't stopped, but in the wooden house, the night had begun to know peace. Michael Reese gently pulled the old rope through the hook, his hand still carrying the smell of mud and damp fabric. Every time he tightened the knot, he felt his fingertips hardening a bit more, as if everything he did left behind a layer of residue on his skin that couldn't be washed away. His military poncho hung there, heavy and silent, just like the way he had chosen to live. Emily had been standing behind Michael for quite a while still, as a tiny flame in the dark corner. Her eyes were fixed on every knot he tied, as though those twists could say something words could not. There was something in the way his hands tightened, pulled slowly, and then released gently that made her heart ache. Not out of fear, but because it reminded her of times when she had tried to hold something that was slipping away inside her heart, but no one ever noticed. "Is your mother still alive?" she asked quietly. Michael didn't respond right away. The rope had been tied long ago, but his hands remained where they were, as if afraid that just letting go would make everything he'd been holding in come crashing out. The question, not full of the innocent curiosity of a child, but fragile like a thread, suddenly tore open an old wound he had kept silent for so long. And standing there, he knew some things had stayed buried, not because they were over, but because he'd never had the courage to name them. "Yes," he replied, as though just that one word could weigh down his chest. "But I don't remember her face." Emily didn't ask anything else. She just lowered her head slightly, then turned and walked into the house as if that answer was enough to open a door inside her that she hadn't dared knock on for so long. The sound of metal clinking against porcelain rang out, followed by the sharp, decisive crash of it shattering like a boundary being broken in the silence. Zoe jumped her feet, sliding back, her back hitting the cold brick wall. She didn't scream or cry, just stared wide-eyed, standing still, as if she had just made an unforgivable mistake. Emily stood nearby, her hand half raised, then stopping, her eyes torn between wanting to approach and an unnamed fear. Michael didn't rush. He slowly moved toward Zoe, his gaze neither judgmental nor worried, but simply full of silent acceptance. When he reached her, he knelt down, his knees touching the cold floor, and gently placed his hand on the ground where the broken pieces lay scattered, as if to promise that nothing else would be shattered in this house. A broken bowl can be pieced together, but the human heart once cracked is hard to mend without leaving a mark. Zoe Reese swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight, as if she had just swallowed a deep fear. She didn't cry, but her arms fell limp and then pulled back slowly, as though she was teaching herself how to survive without disturbing the world around her. In that moment, Michael felt a void within him, filled by something soft and quiet, like a door latch gently moved aside. That night, Zoe Reese fell ill without warning. Her eyes grew cloudy as if the light had faded from her small soul, her arms and legs grew unusually hot, and every breath rushed out quickly as though she were desperately trying to hold on to life's fragile rhythm. Michael didn't wait for confirmation from himself. He picked up the phone and called Rachel, his voice hoarse, as if each word carried the weight of unspoken fear. Rachel didn't ask many questions. "Get the paperwork ready. I'll meet you at the hospital entrance." The entire drive, Michael held Zoe Reese close to his chest, feeling each rapid breath through his damp shirt. Emily sat beside him, her hands gripping the edges of her shirt, her eyes gazing out the window but focused on nothing in particular. When the car turned down a small hill, the flashing lights of a police car suddenly swept across the windshield, causing the air inside to become compressed, like someone had pulled an invisible cord tight around the chest of all three. Officer Ramirez stepped closer, his gaze scanning the interior of the car with discreet attention. When he stopped in front of Michael, his hand subtly moved toward his belt, not out of caution, but as a reflex from years of handling street situations. I received a report about a man taking 2 children out of the relief zone. No ID. Can I see your papers? Michael pulled the temporary guardianship papers from his jacket pocket with slightly trembling hands. The cold crept through the damp fabric, numbing his fingers, but his gaze remained steady, unwavering. Ramirez carefully examined each page, his eyes no longer filled with just suspicion, but with a hesitation that was hard to define. He glanced at Zoe Reese, his eyes lingering long enough to notice the pale sheen on her forehead. The girl isn't doing well. Can you tell me what happened? She started getting feverish early on, but I hoped it was just exhaustion from the long trip. When her eyes started to lose focus, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to get her to the hospital. Emily leaned in slightly, her small hand resting on Michael's arm, not with force, but with quiet certainty. Her gaze fixed on his mouth, a place where a smile had never fully bloomed since they first met. Is it possible that doing the right thing can be seen as wrong just because it's different from what people are used to believing? Uncle Ramirez stood frozen, his gaze no longer sharp, but weighed down with something that almost resembled regret. He glanced at Emily one last time before looking long at Michael's face, as though confronting a memory he too had tried to avoid. His finger brushed against his holster, but quickly withdrew, not out of fear, but because something clear had just risen within him. After everything, he spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Keep going. I'll pretend I never stopped this car." The car turned gently to the right, continuing down the waterlogged road, and inside, the silence remained. Michael didn't say anything, just subtly leaned over, letting his hand slip into Emily's, as if this was a habit he had never learned, but was now just right. Not to comfort, but to remind himself that the most fragile things often only exist when we have the courage to hold them with both hands. There are questions that seem fleeting, but they sink into your heart like a grain of sand caught between your eyelids. And maybe what we need most isn't an answer, but a gaze, gentle enough not to turn away when we're learning how to ask for the first time. The sound was as thin as fingernails tapping against ceramic, so light it seemed meaningless, yet enough for Michael to turn his head slightly. Outside, the silence didn't seem like peace, but more like an enduring weight. The ceiling fans spun slowly, not to cool the room, but as if it were circling memories round and round, neither hasty nor ceasing. On the faded gray table, a stack of files lay half open, the empty boxes seeming to wait for someone steady enough to write something irreversible inside. The pen was placed crookedly, its tip still retracted as if it too hesitated before touching the paper. Michael picked up the first sheet, stared at the blank space, and then gently let it fall back down, as if afraid that just one ink mark would make the decision irreversible. The room was still as a blank sheet when the doorframe shifted slightly. Raphael stepped in his military jacket, still bearing traces of dried mud on the cuffs. Without greeting, he pulled out a chair and sat down, his breath escaping as though it had been holding back a conversation from days ago. There are some things that don't belong to us, Michael. No matter how much we want to keep them, they won't stay, especially the things that don't come from blood. Michael didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the empty bowl before him. Have you ever seen someone walk the line between life and death and still choose to carry an extra weight in their heart? Raphael spoke softly, his gaze lingering like an old trail of smoke. They're children, yes, but they're also bottomless pits. Once you throw your heart and life into them, all that's left for yourself is emptiness. Silence lingered. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice slow, devoid of any trace of anger. Have you ever felt chosen, even if it was just because someone needed you? Raphael gave a soft laugh, but his eyes didn't smile. That feeling only comes and goes, Michael, like the warmth of a fire on a stormy night. It doesn't leave gratitude behind, but a weight that pulls you deeper. And you tie yourself to the wounds of others as if you want to patch up pieces of a memory that no one can hold on to anymore. Another moment of silence passed. Michael slowly folded the stack of papers and set it aside. They just need someone who won't leave. But I need something big enough not to lose myself, he said. Sometimes when those two things meet, It's enough for a person not to lose their way. Raphael didn't say anything more. He stood up gently, placing his hand on Elias's shoulder, neither strong nor hurried. Then, get ready. Because holding on to someone else always comes with a cost, especially when they were once something no one dared to claim. As the door closed behind Raphael, Michael Reese remained seated back, straight eyes unblinking. The room suddenly felt so still that even the sound of his heartbeat seemed to echo from a distant place. Everything in that room seemed like the outer shell of a decision that hadn't yet fully formed, suspended like the last breath before the evening shadows left the doorstep. Emily Reese slowly drew the curtain aside and stepped out with a hesitant yet firm gait. She didn't say anything, just holding a folded piece of paper in her hands, its edges slightly creased with a faint blue stain as if the rain had soaked through. She placed it gently in front of Elias, her eyes fixed on his face. Not a word, no unnecessary movement, as if everything that needed to be said was already written on that paper. The three of them held hands, the drawing simple yet certain. In the center was the slanted writing, Tio Elias. No one spoke, but the air in the room suddenly thickened, as though something heavy had just been placed down between them. Michael Reese lowered his head to look at the paper, his hand still lightly resting on the stack of unfinished papers. Without saying a word, he slowly lifted the drawing, folded it with quiet reverence, as one would keep the only memory strong enough to hold on to a home. Then he pressed it to his chest as if afraid that if he let go, it would all slip away. That night, the sound of the rain hitting the roof tiles seemed like someone softly knocking at an unspoken worry. The hallway light stayed on, casting a thin golden thread across the room, as if the house was still waiting for someone's footsteps to return. When Michael Reese opened the door to step out, his eyes immediately stopped at the empty space in the corner of the room. The little coat was gone, and the tiny slippers that had once been near the mat were no longer there either. A small empty space, but it felt as though it had taken away the first breath of the morning. On the table, there was no painting, but a small piece of paper was placed neatly. If you plan to send us back, we'll go on our own. Without thinking much, Michael Reese put on his shoes and quickly stepped out into the street. The rain from last night had left puddles and the sidewalks were slick with mud, but Michael Reese didn't look down. He searched around the market, asking at the bakery, the pharmacy, even the old bus station. Time passed slowly, like a broken clock. When the streetlights came on, Michael Reese finally stopped at the alley near the church. The heavy iron gate was still ajar. And right there, under the old brick porch, two small figures sat huddled together, backs pressed against each other. Zoe Reese had fallen asleep on Emily Reese's shoulder. The older sister wasn't asleep, but her eyes didn't look at anyone. She just stared ahead at the statue of the saint above, where the candlelight still flickered. Michael Reese approached and knelt in front of them. He didn't ask why. He just opened his arms and said, "No matter how many people turn their backs on you in this life, I will never be the one to walk away from you." Emily Reese quietly cried, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding on tightly. Some are born to walk away, and some are born to stay. And for some children, all it takes is one person not to turn their back, and that's enough for them to believe the world still has a place for them. Zoe Reese sat on the old wooden chair, her small hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth, as if it was the last boundary keeping her in place on that cold winter afternoon. No one asked, no one pushed, but the gaze was enough for a child to understand they were in a place not meant for them. Michael Reese looked at her, then glanced at Emily, who was adjusting the collar of her shirt that Mrs. Grace Mitchell had ironed flat that morning. He didn't say anything, but the fact that he still stood there, his hands gently placed on the shoulders of the two girls as if to keep them from slipping off the earth, was his way of responding to everything. The atmosphere in the church seemed a little different since the last time Michael had been here with his team during a food-sharing night. Today, the tables were arranged close together, as if no one wanted to leave any space, as if sitting closer would open people's hearts more. Chairs had been pulled from the living rooms. Even the old plastic ones from the storage were brought out. The elderly people from the end of the street were also present, not to eat, but to sit quietly, hands clutching glasses of lemonade, silently observing as if they too were searching for a sense of belonging. The atmosphere wasn't exactly lively, but it was no longer as tense as the community meetings full of scrutinizing glances from before. There were still a few judgmental stares, still the silence of caution, but there were also slight nods instead of greetings. And in that moment, a delicate change began. "Are you really not going to eat?" Michael asked softly, tilting his head, still looking at the communal table where portions of stewed beans and white rice were being served. Zoe Reese shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. Emily took the spoon, but her hand trembled. Under the table, her two small feet were pressed tightly together, as if afraid to step on something that would dirty their fragile dream. "Try it, the beans here, just like how we make them at home." Emily whispered, her eyes looking down as if she wasn't quite sure about the reassurance that slipped out. Michael turned away, saying nothing, but his hand still gently rested on Zoe Reese's chair, as if to let her know he hadn't left. Mrs. Grace Mitchell was at that moment bustling between the tables, her left hand holding a tray of water, her right rummaging through a basket of paper cups, picking one that wasn't dented. Her flustered appearance contrasted with the mischievous glint in her eyes, like a child hiding candy behind their back. When she saw Zoe Reese glancing occasionally toward the dessert table, she smiled faintly and leaned into the ear of the young man who was wiping down dishes. "Bring me the special flan early. That curly-haired girl looks like she's waiting for a miracle to happen without saying a word." She then moved closer to Michael, gently tapping his elbow, speaking low enough for only him to hear. "Kids aren't rocks. Don't let them sit still for too long. It's cruel. If a child is invited to the table but doesn't eat, it's not their fault, it's the way we've served them." Before long, the voice of teacher Sarah Villalobos rang out above the sounds of spoons clinking on plates. She walked up holding a small bag and brought 2 fresh notebooks with the smell of ink still on them. "Emily, Zoe Reese, you've both received scholarships from the Community Welfare Fund. I signed you up." She held out the notebooks and sat down at Zoe Reese's eye level. "The teacher just had to see your handwriting to know you liked to write, didn't she?" Zoe Reese hesitated before nodding. Michael didn't say anything, but his hand still rested on her shoulder. At that moment, a group of young people brought out guitars and started playing an old bolero tune. The melody was soft enough to make the afternoon feel a little lighter. As people began to smile at the sound of the music, Emily Reese unexpectedly knocked over the glass of water she was holding. The whole room seemed to freeze, as if a wound had been opened in everyone's hearts. Water splashed across the table and spilled onto the red-tiled floor. Before anyone could say anything, Mrs. Grace Mitchell started laughing. She walked over to pick up the glass, and with a gentle chuckle, she said, "I remember spilling 3 glasses when I was your age. No one ever died from spilling a glass, sweetie." Her laughter echoed around the room, spreading like a shadow of warmth on a gloomy day. An old man sitting at the other end of the table chuckled long and whispered to the person next to him, "I heard that from my mother decades ago. Turns out it still works." Michael Reese glanced at the 2 girls again. Emily Reese still held onto the spoon as though she was figuring out how to use it properly, while Zoe Reese adjusted her sitting posture, one hand resting on her knee, her eyes still looking around, but no longer avoiding anyone. No one pressured them to speak, and no one made them feel forced to engage with anyone by talking or smiling. But in the silence, there was an invisible layer being peeled away, little by little. The cautious glances from earlier in the meal began to soften, replaced by quiet, watchful gazes, no longer critical, just waiting. The guitar music continued to play in the corner of the yard, and the initial tension started to melt like morning dew under the first rays of sunlight. When the flan was served, Mrs. Grace Mitchell personally placed the portion in front of Zoe Reese. "This one I made extra, not from the main batch. If you don't like it, save it for later. But if you can eat 1 spoonful, I'll tell you about the time I fought with the neighbor over not sharing my recipe." Zoe Reese smiled faintly. It wasn't loud nor very clear, but to Elias, it felt like a drop of dew falling on dry earth after a storm. A child doesn't need much to trust, but adults, they need a lot to dare love unconditionally. And sometimes just a brief smile is enough to make someone want to stay longer for a lifetime. As the meal was nearing its end, Emily Reese leaned over and whispered something into Zoe Reese's ear. The little girl listened and nodded. They both stood up and quietly walked over to Mrs. Grace Mitchell, whispering something in her ear. She smiled, patted their heads, then bent down to give them a gentle hug. Michael Reese couldn't hear what they said, but when the girls returned to the table, Zoe Reese tugged at his shirt. She still looked down, but her voice was clear. "I like it here." He didn't reply. He simply placed his hand gently on her shoulder, holding it in a long, quiet touch. In the dim golden light of the evening, the sound of spoons scraping plates became quieter, and the music softened. But that one sentence Michael Reese knew would echo for a long time, even through the coming long rainy season. Whenever someone asked him why he chose to take in 2 children who weren't his own, he would just remember that look, that hand, and that sentence. Family isn't formed from blood. It's built through staying even when everything else tells you to leave. There are moments when the line between what we perceive and what others impose on us blurs like smoke after a long rain. Michael Reese still kept the habit of sitting on the edge of his chair when facing important questions, not because of a lack of confidence, but because he believed that if he stepped back just a little, the biases of others wouldn't advance any further. "Could you tell me your average monthly income?" Rachel Monroe's voice was even not accusing, but lacking any warmth. She was simply doing her job as a social worker. Michael didn't answer immediately. His gaze stopped on the page in front of him, where the blank spaces seemed like shadows of things he had never learned to name. He had stood amid gunfire without flinching, but now just a simple statistic on a form made his heart break into quiet pieces. This poverty wasn't measured by money. It was measured by the helpless feeling of not being able to gather all the love he had and put it into a clear number. The gate bell rang sharply. Rachel glanced at her watch, her hand still on the pen. Michael glanced at the window before bowing his head again. The gate creaked as it was pushed open, as if the person entering didn't need an invitation. Sylvia Maldonado stepped in her dark coat, slightly wet from the rain, but still walking with the proud stride of someone who believed the wooden floor beneath her feet had never been meant to bear the marks of such luxurious shoes. Her eyes scanned the room, not hiding her judgment. "I came as invited, but I didn't expect to play the role of a spectator in this self-directed drama," she said. Rachel didn't answer. She added another line to the paper, her handwriting slanting to the right. Michael stood up without speaking, pulled another wooden chair over, and motioned for Sylvia to sit. She took the seat with the demeanor of someone who would not let anyone off the hook. "So you're planning to raise these 2 children?" Sylvia asked, her tone sharp. "I don't mind, but I have to ask, what exactly do you have to raise them? An old house, a few cans of dry rice, and a nice idealistic picture like the ones in church?" Her words struck Michael like a knife, slicing through the taut cord in his heart. But he didn't react. He simply looked toward the corner of the room where Zoe used to sit playing with a dry leaf, and where Emily would fill tiny cups with water just to watch the bubbles rise. Rachel gently put the pen down. "I'm not here to argue. I just need verified information to complete the paperwork. As for right and wrong time, we'll answer that." Sylvia scoffed lightly. "Time those kids need a real home, not an emotional shack." Rachel nodded, her eyes moving toward Michael. "And that's why I need your answer." Michael remained silent, his hand gently touching the pen, then just rolling it back and forth on the table like an unconscious habit. In that moment, Emily Reese's voice suddenly returned, like a piece of a memory that hadn't dried yet. "If one day I draw the 3 of us in the same frame, does that mean I've believed you're truly part of our family? Do you think you deserve that?" That evening, as the darkness seeped into the cracks of the wooden walls, Michael Reese sat still in the corner of the table, his posture unmoving, as if listening to his old self speak. The stew from the afternoon was still on the stove, the layer of fat floating on top as thin as memory, untouched by anyone. In the house, the soft crackling from the porch echoed like the slowing heartbeat of a man who didn't know why he was holding his breath. The asset declaration lay wide open on the table, the blank spaces as though he needed to redraw his entire life with numbers he had never learned to count. No one taught him how to value a hug, or the look Zoe Reese gave him every morning. or the patience Emily showed when drying his wet shoes with that tiny little cloth. The door softly clicked 3 short knocks before opening just as Michael stood up. Daniel Brooks entered with the familiar air of someone who had shared rations in the wilderness. In his hand, he held an old photograph, its corners slightly bent, the edges faded. He didn't say anything, he just silently placed it on the table, right next to the asset declaration that was half empty. The picture captured the moment Michael carried the elderly woman Martha Jenkins through the rushing water. His eyes in the photo looked straight ahead, tense but unyielding. His face was covered in mud, his hair sticking to his forehead, and his arm tightly gripping her frail shoulder, as though afraid she would slip away from the world if he let go for even a second. You've chosen the right path, not because others told you to, but because you couldn't do otherwise. Don't let cold numbers and skeptical glances obscure what those 2 kids see in you every day. Michael stared at the photo for a long time. Then he turned back to the table for the first time in years, not seeing himself as just a shadow. The next morning, Michael brought the asset declaration to Rachel Monroe. On the final box, he had written, "I don't have much, but I have 2 kids who call me home." Rachel took it, reading each word slowly, then closed the file as if she had just heard a story written with the heart. She sat quietly for a moment, her hand still resting lightly on the file. Before she left, she stopped at the door, turned back, and spoke in a voice that seemed to echo like a soft breeze. And sometimes that's all it takes to live a good life. Michael stayed in place, his hand frozen in the air as if still holding onto the paper. His eyes weren't bright, but they weren't clouded anymore. Inside his chest, where there had only been the echo of loneliness, there now came a different beat, small but steady. It wasn't joy, but the quiet revival of a man who hadn't believed he had anything left to hold on to. Some lives don't need to be proven by accomplishments or paperwork. They just need a look of trust from those we love. And sometimes just one small word is enough to lay the foundation for a home, one that doesn't have glamour, doesn't have contracts of fame, but just the familiar sighs of someone who once knew what war was, and now learns how to teach a child to love peace. The atmosphere in the hospital corridor was suffused with cold white light, still as if time itself had been suspended in a moment of lingering anxiety. The hum of the air conditioning was a quiet, controlled sigh, like the effort to suppress the nervous breath of those waiting. On the long row of plastic chairs, a few women huddled together in their coats, exchanging fragmented whispers. The emergency room door was tightly shut, silent as a tomb, except for the small illuminated sign flashing, "No pays, no entry." Emily Reese sat hunched over her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, her head slightly tilted toward the door, as if straining to hear any sound from the other side. Michael Reese stood behind her, not leaning against the wall, but keeping his eyes fixed on Emily Reese's tense expression. He didn't touch her shoulder, but the space between them was close enough to feel their breaths both tense with fear. "Why haven't they said anything yet, Uncle?" Emily Reese's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Elias's heart like a sharp blade. He didn't answer right away. His left hand still held the temporary guardianship paper that Rachel had quickly printed the afternoon before. The corner of the paper was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been held too much, not kept carefully. Michael Reese glanced at it once more, then looked up. In front of him was the receptionist's desk, where a middle-aged woman in a turquoise blouse was marking documents with ink. Michael Reese stepped forward. His voice, still deep, lacked the steady tone it usually had. "Excuse me, I need to know about Zoe Reese's condition." The woman looked up, her gaze scanning his weathered face, then stopping at the crumpled paper between his trembling fingers. "Who are you to the girl?" The question was asked routinely, like it had been many times before, but there was an undertone of suspicion behind it. Michael Reese didn't respond immediately. He quietly spread the paper on the desk, as if placing his heart down in a place uncertain whether it would be accepted. "I'm her temporary guardian. Here's the official documentation from the Department of Children and Family Services." The receptionist picked up the paper, her eyes moving over the text several times before she shook her head slightly. "This document is not enough to grant access to the emergency room. We require an official guardianship document or approval from a legal family member." Michael Reese didn't answer. his lips pressed together. Emily Reese stood up, stepped closer, and placed her hand on the back of his. "Uncle, if they don't believe us, we can just sit here. I'm not scared, as long as you don't leave us." Her small words tugged at Elias, holding him in place. He turned his head, meeting Emily Reese's gaze. There was no fear, no hesitation left. She looked at him like he was the last person who could stop her from being lost in the storm. A man in a white coat walked by his eyes, flicking over Elias's face before pausing. Romero Michael Reese turned around. It was the chief doctor, the one who had been injured when he slipped while rescuing people during the flood 3 years ago. Michael Reese had carried him across the raging waters to the nearest medical point. "Doctor!" The man nodded, then looked at Emily Reese before turning to the receptionist. "Let me see the file for room 3. The girl's name is Zoe Reese." The receptionist nervously handed over a stack of papers. The doctor skimmed through them quickly. "Is this her father?" Michael didn't answer right away. He felt the rhythm of Emily's heartbeat through the hand that was holding his. In that moment, he didn't think about the procedures or the paperwork. He only thought about the night before, when Zoe had curled up in the blanket, sweat pouring from her forehead, clutching the edge of Emily's shirt, calling out her mother's name in her sleep, but unable to cry out loud. He looked up and nodded at the doctor, a small, firm gesture. "Yes, Zoe is my daughter." No one asked anything more. The door to the room opened and the yellow light spilled out like a sigh of relief. The doctor nodded at Michael. "You can come in, but remember to wear protective gear. She's past the high fever." Michael didn't look around, didn't say thank you. He just took Emily's hand. "You wait here, okay? Zoe needs to see someone familiar when she wakes up." Emily nodded. She didn't cry, just whispered to remind herself. "You said, no one's gonna leave me, right, Uncle?" The room inside was as quiet as a breath held. Zoe was lying on her side, her right hand still hooked to an IV, her pulse faint under the thin skin. Her face was flushed from the fever, her eyelashes damp with sweat. Michael quietly pulled up a chair, didn't dare touch her, just gently placed his sun-darkened hand next to her tiny one, silently reassuring her that he wasn't going anywhere. That moment didn't need any words, just presence. A moment later, Zoe let out a soft groan. Her eyelids fluttered. Her eyes opened in the dim light from the nightlight, drifting for a few seconds before focusing on Michael. She didn't react strongly. She just furrowed her brow. "Uncle, you're not going home." Michael shook his head. "I'm right where I need to be." She smiled faintly, then closed her eyes again. Before she drifted off to sleep, she murmured with dry lips, "Daddy, don't leave." Michael didn't respond. He just gently touched the edge of the blanket, pulling it over her shoulders to cover her. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall softly as if it had never stopped. But inside that room, a family had just been born, not through paperwork or tests, but through a quiet call enough to soothe the old scars buried deep under skin no one had ever touched. One doesn't learn how to be a father from books. One learns by staying when everything else falls apart. "Do you remember what you said back then?" Emily Reese stood backstage, gently adjusting the collar of her white blouse, which had been pressed last night. Zoe Reese stood beside her, silent, tracing her finger along the crease of an old, worn-out picture, as though she were trying to trace the outlines of a memory that would never fade. "You said, if he doesn't come back, we'll just sit under the rain until the sky understands and stops crying." "Yeah?" Emily Reese nodded slightly, then looked up at the deep red curtain in front of her. "And he didn't make us wait." The silence wasn't long, but it was enough for the two sisters to share one last glance before stepping into the blinding lights. A stagehand appeared, gave a slight nod, and motioned as if opening the door for something more important to be revealed. "Your turn," he said. Neither of them said anything. Zoe Reese carefully folded the picture, tucked it into her blouse pocket, then silently took Emily Reese's wrist. Her fingers were still thin and long, but now they felt warm, like a promise that would never be broken. They stepped out onto the stage. The bright spotlight focused on the two women standing tall, their white shirts glowing in the light, but their eyes searching for the front row, where a man with salt and pepper hair sat quietly among the applause. Emily Reese raised the microphone. "Hello, everyone." Her voice wasn't shaky, nor was it forced. It carried the tone of someone who had spent many sleepless nights in mountain clinics, holding the cold hands of patients she couldn't save. But today she wasn't speaking as a nurse. She spoke as someone who had once been a child in need of comfort. 19 years ago, my sister and I were just two lost kids, not knowing who to call family, not knowing where home was. Zoe Reese looked down at her hand, lightly touching the fabric of her blouse pocket where a memory was hidden. She pulled out the crumpled picture, laminated as if someone had tried to preserve something fragile. Without looking, she remembered to the left a tall man, in the middle a messy-haired girl smiling with her head tilted, and to the right the older sister with eyes always seeking the safest place, his hand. Emily Reese continued, her gaze fixated on each face below. "We are here because of someone who wasn't our blood, but who held our hands tighter than anyone who ever gave birth to us." Whispers rose, then quickly faded. Some people in the back row raised their hands to cover their mouths, their eyes fixed on the large screen above where the face of a man appeared clearly, his hand still clutching a faded baseball cap, as though holding onto a memory he couldn't let go of. Michael Reese Romero didn't smile, nor did he shed a tear. He only bowed his head deeper as if he wanted to offer his thanks for the two children who had once trembled in the storm years ago. Zoe Reese took the microphone from her sister. "When he found us, the world around us seemed to be extinguished. There was no trust left, no answers. The rain fell through the torn cardboard box, each drop drowning out the last hope. But he didn't ask who we were. He didn't need reasons, didn't need names. He just asked." She paused, her lips pressing together to hold back the tremble in her voice. Emily Reese placed her hand on her sister's shoulder. He only asked, "Are you too cold?" And in that moment I understood that sometimes a simple question is enough to warm a forgotten childhood. The room fell silent. Emily Reese took the painting from Zoe Reese's hands and held it high. We painted this one rainy night when no one was sure that tomorrow would come, but he held our hands, never letting go even after the rain had stopped. The applause echoed not as a formal gesture, but as a sigh of relief from hundreds of chests that had held their breath. People didn't need to understand the whole story. They just needed to see two women standing together, their hands tightly holding onto one another, eyes focused on a single person. And that was enough. Today's titles seemed like mere excuses to prove that there are things that don't need bloodlines, but still carry the weight of family. As the sound quieted, Zoe Reese placed her hand on the microphone again. "We know there are still countless children like us from back then, abandoned after natural disasters, standing among evacuees with no one coming back for them, not even a name for anyone to call them." Emily Reese nodded. "That's why today we're announcing the Michael Reese Romero Scholarship for Children Abandoned in Springfield during the flood seasons." Zoe Reese continued, her voice stronger. "A scholarship that doesn't just fund books, but also provides housing, health care, and most importantly, the feeling that these children deserve to be heard, held, and called child, even without blood ties." Her voice didn't need to be justified, because in the front row, the eyes of the man who had just dried his tears were wet again. Emily Reese lowered the microphone and bowed. Zoe Reese followed. The entire auditorium stood clapping the applause, lingering. Some older people nodded as if remembering someone from their past. Some younger people placed their hands over their hearts as though afraid their emotions might overflow. The host stepped forward, his voice choked. "Please, let's give another round of applause to Mr. Michael Reese Romero. Not just the soldier who crossed floods to save lives, but also the father of children the world had once forgotten." The man stood up slowly, as if lifting the weight of the years behind him. His old shirt was neatly pressed, his polished shoes quietly standing still, and his nod was not proud nor reluctant, but a silent thank you for the children who once believed they had no one to rely on. One can raise a child with money, but to raise a person you need to use your own heart to hold on to what no one else will. People often believe that family is where we take our first cries. But in Briarwood, on a rainy night that no one remembers how long ago another family was born, simply by one simple question: are you too cold? That afternoon, the sun wasn't as scorching as in the previous summers. The wind from the small hill at the end of Southwood Street swept through the old roof tiles, gently rustling the rough fabric curtain hanging in the window of the wooden house. Michael Reese was carefully wiping the dust from the windowsill, his hands moving slowly, as if each smudge reminded him of some memory long dried up over the years. With every stroke of the rag, there was tenderness in the movement of a man who had spent his life holding on to one idea, the place called home. The wooden house where he lived was no longer new. The floorboards creaked, and the small cracks running along the walls looked like veins exposed on the hands of an elderly man. But there was still warmth in every crack. Maybe it was the sound of laughter that once echoed here, or the sound of little feet running across the floor during the rainy days. Michael didn't have biological children, but he had a family. For a long time he had wondered, could he be a father without ever holding a newborn baby, without ever hearing anyone call him dad? But then he understood that being a father wasn't about blood. It was about the moment you choose not to turn away from someone who needs you the most, and in that moment, he chose. The sound of a car horn broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him lift his head. His eyes, though dulled with age, still shone with an odd glimmer. The small gray car stopped under the jacaranda tree, the purple flowers already scattered across the steps. Emily Reese got out first. Her hair now had streaks of silver. Her gait wasn't as quick as before, but it was firm like an old tree whose roots had dug deep into the dry soil. Zoe Reese followed, holding the hands of two twin children around 4 or 5 years old, the smallest one nestled in Emily Reese's arms. The children chattered excitedly, their wide eyes gazing at the house as if they had just discovered a long-lost treasure. One of the twins looked up and asked, her voice clear and bright, "Grandpa, were you really a soldier?" Michael chuckled. It was a laugh that hadn't come out in a long time, like the wind brushing against an old guitar string. He bent down to the child's level and gently patted her on the shoulder. "Yes," he replied. "I was a soldier. But my greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was when I no longer had to eat alone." The children giggled. Emily Reese carried the smallest child inside, while Zoe Reese and the other two ran around the yard exploring every nook and cranny. Zoe Reese sat on the porch steps, letting the two children lean into her. Emily Reese placed a fabric bag down beside her, pulling out a plastic container filled with tamales. Michael reached to take it, but his gaze lingered a little longer on Emily Reese, where her eyes no longer held suspicion, but the calm of someone who had weathered the storm and was no longer afraid. "Dad," Emily Reese began slowly, "I think it's time we talk about the past." Michael paused for a moment. His eyes drifted to the garden where the children were laughing merrily among the wildflowers. The light atmosphere felt like a soft layer of memory resting on his shoulders. Then, as if gathering words from deep within, he nodded quietly. "I'm listening." Emily Reese spoke of her biological parents who had abandoned her and her sister during the storm all those years ago, only to return now with papers and reasoning about the duty of being a child. They cited years of poverty meals that were never enough and claimed they deserved compensation for giving birth to 2 daughters who had now made a name for themselves. "But we're not letting that slide," Zoe Reese said calmly but firmly. "We've gathered testimonies, documents, even memories no one wants to talk about, and this time, justice won't turn a blind eye." Michael sat still. His face remained unchanged, but his hand on his knee tightened for a moment, then relaxed. There are people who think of themselves as roots, but it's the first winds of the season that prove they never really took root. He said, his voice as soft as a breeze. It wasn't a complaint, just a simple truth that every older person comes to understand. The old wooden cabinet in the corner of the room stood undisturbed as it had for years. On top of it was a dark brown wooden box, its paint chipped, but Michael kept it like a treasure. Emily gently opened the lid. Inside was a drawing that had yellowed with age, the edges creased from time. The two children in the drawing, a girl with messy hair holding her younger sibling, both sitting in a cardboard box in the rain, the lines of the drawing still shaky, but the emotion was unmistakable. Zoe gently touched the corner of the picture. "We start here, don't we?" Her voice as soft as a spring breeze. Michael nodded, no need for many words. He sat down in the old chair next to the dining table, his hands trembling slightly with age, but his gaze was steady. "That cardboard box isn't worth remembering," he said quietly. "But the two in it, I'll never forget." Outside, the sky began to cloud over. The last light of the day touched the faces of everyone in the room, creating a silence that no one dared to break. The children stopped running as if sensing something sacred in this wooden room. In the kitchen, the kettle began to boil. Michael prepared 3 cups of tea, the kind he used to make on those quiet afternoons when he remembered his daughter during the long, rainy days. Today, he wasn't drinking alone. Emily picked up her cup, blew on it gently, and took a sip. She set the cup down and looked around the wooden house, the place where her childhood had been stolen, then spoke slowly. "I used to think family was where you're born, but now I understand sometimes it's where you choose to return." Michael nodded. There are children who aren't born from their mother's womb, but grow up in someone else's heart. And when a heart opens, it doesn't need bloodlines to love. Laughter from the children echoed from the backyard, shattering the loneliness that had once hung over the house. The cracks in the walls were still there, but now bougainvillea had climbed up, covering them. Just like love covering loss, not erasing it, but softening it. They ate dinner together around the old wooden table. Conversations without beginnings or ends, memories retold like old color films. No one was in a rush. Time here wasn't measured by minutes or seconds, but by glances and breaths. As night fell, Zoe carefully folded the picture and placed it back in the box. Michael Reese gently placed his hand on the lid, as if closing an old chapter but not locking it. It was simply a way to make space for new memories. Outside, the night wind blew softly. In that old wooden house, once a temporary shelter for 2 abandoned children, it had now become the warmest place in the hearts of 3 generations. And Michael, the man who had no blood relation to anyone in that house, had closed the circle of love with a simple yet profound act. There are families not formed by blood, but by the moment when a heart chooses to stay, even without any bond except love. By the window frame, the yellow light flickered softly like the heartbeat of a house still alive. A light not meant to show the way, but to whisper that here there will always be someone keeping the door open for you to return. Some encounters are not part of fate's plan, yet they have the power to change the lives of many people. Michael Reese. The soldier who seemed to only be on a relief mission during the storm found himself stepping into the role of a father when his heart chose not to turn away from 2 small souls abandoned in a wet cardboard box. And then, 19 years later, that same heart was returned with pure love from the 2 daughters he had once held in his arms amid the wind and rain. Life is quietly fair. The one who had callously turned their back was forced to face justice and the silence of those they no longer had the right to call child. Meanwhile, the one who dared to open their arms in the midst of adversity found a complete family, not by blood, but by trust. Have you ever thought that sometimes family doesn't have to be tied by blood, but reborn in the moments when we choose to step toward a child who needs a hug? If you were in that situation, would you have the courage to stop in the middle of that storm? Would you dare to listen to the fragile cries in that cardboard box? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever met someone not of your blood, but who became an important part of your life? What do you believe truly makes a family? And if you're somewhere carrying old wounds in your heart, I hope this story will warm you a little today. I'd also like to check in. How have you been lately? Is there anything worrying or tiring you? If so, please share a word. Sometimes a story like this, a small corner to listen, can soothe someone's heart. If this story touched, you don't hesitate to leave a heart or a word of amen to help spread compassion. Because who knows, somewhere there might still be in Michael Reese, quietly saving a child in the middle of a storm.